The statewide proposal to allow local municipalities to allow rent control in Colorado has failed. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, I'll be the first one to admit I was wrong, okay? I thought for sure that this rent control proposal in Colorado was going to pass and that we were going to start seeing more places throughout the state of Colorado suddenly having rent control policies put in place, but it failed. I'm really kind of surprised because, Colorado has been much more progressive, much more left leaning, yet somehow they were able to, get rid of this horrible, horrible rent control proposal altogether. And I'm happy about that, but it makes me feel like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm a bit pessimistic. Maybe there is hope out there somehow for landlords to be able to retain their property rights and be able to run their businesses the way they see fit. Or maybe the state of Colorado, it didn't pass it right now, and in the future something like this will pass. Who knows? Only time will tell. But for now, landlords are in the clear and they don't have to worry about this kind of rent control proposal passing. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Are you surprised? Are you surprised at the news that this rent control proposal did not pass in the state of Colorado? Now, for any landlords watching this from Colorado, especially I want to read the comments from you because you have a much more insider perspective than I do looking from the outside. From the outside, I'm probably just seeing the major, Denver area, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, the whole state is probably being dictated by that area, and that's why rent control is probably going to pass. But maybe the outer areas were able to keep it in check and make sure that it didn't pass right now. Okay, so anyway, let's read this article because it has a bit more of the details. This article is coming from the DurangoHerald.com, and it says Colorado rent control bill fails in committee. One of the panel's Democrats joined Republicans to kill legislation. This one's really hard for me. It's a good sign when you hear that, hey, you know what? This is a bipartisan thing, okay? There are people on both sides of the aisle that realize that rent control doesn't work and that it actually will make things work. It'll make it so there's less development. It'll make it so the costs are more. It'll make it harder for tenants to find affordable housing. And the few tenants who benefit from rent control, guess what? It's not means tested. So there's no guarantee that those people even have the need. It's not like it only applies to people who are lower class or lower middle class. No, it applies to everybody. So that's why these rent control policies are really a disaster wherever they're implemented. But anyway, let's continue. A proposal to allow local rent control laws in Colorado has failed. Since 1981, the state has banned local governments from setting limits on how much landlords can increase their rents. A bill in the state legislature would have undone that prohibition, allowing cities to enact rent control or rent stabilization policies. Senator Dylan Roberts, an Eagle County Democrat, joined 3 Republicans to vote down the measure at a committee hearing on Tuesday. So yeah, Colorado actually has a law in place since 1981, it says here, that bans rent control throughout the entire state. I didn't know that. Okay, so this is a good thing, that they said, hey, we're not going to attempt to remove that law. We're going to keep that ban in place and not allow local municipalities to make up their own rules. And like I've mentioned in other rent control articles, like the one whenever I bring up St. Paul, Minnesota. So St. Paul passed this rent control law, but none of the surrounding area did. So it's just this little island of rent control. And you know how developers, landlords are going to react when they see that rent control is implemented in this little tiny area. They're going to just step right outside of that area where there is no rent control, and they're going to invest there. They're going to build there. And the city of St. Paul becomes a place where, hey, there hasn't been any development in our little city in a long time, and we just can't figure out why. Well, that's because you have a rent control law and the suburbs don't, Minneapolis doesn't, etc. Okay, so you've screwed yourself over. These rent control laws, if they want them to work, they would have to implement them statewide. And you know what? It's very, very rare. I believe California and Oregon, I have read that both of those states have caps on the amount that rent can be increased. But most of the time, it's just these little local municipalities that implement the laws. So you're hurting yourself if you implement a rent control law in your city, thinking, oh, nobody's ever gonna want to build outside of here. Like imagine, just you have a big major city, and almost every major city in the entire country is surrounded by larger suburban populations. Even New York City, which has a population of 8 million, well, the entire region around it has a population of close to 20 million. So that means that there are 12 million people who live in areas outside of the city, right? And there's so many little small towns, so many different counties, multiple different states, and everyone has different rules, right? And developers and real estate investors and people like me, we see that, and we pick and choose where we want to put our money, so to where we can make the most profit. This one's really hard for me. I fully agree and see every day that housing is at a crisis, Robert said. But he went on, I've become convinced that rent control, even in a local manner like this, could and probably would stifle development. The control measure would not have directly created any limits on rent prices, but it would have allowed city governments to pass their own rent regulations. Cities still would have had to allow rents to rise faster than inflation. Well, you know what? It doesn't matter if the city implements a law that says, oh, well, you have to be able to allow rents to rise faster than inflation. The only thing that matters is how much each individual specific landlord is charging. So, like I've mentioned many times before, there are many landlords who don't do rent increases on their tenants until, the tenant, they don't raise the rent on their property until their tenant moves on. So for a landlord who's had the same tenant in their property for the last 10 years, they might have never done a rent increase. Just as long as they were able to pay their bills and make a little bit of profit, they were perfectly happy. They wanted to keep the place occupied. So the rents are set at the level of 10 years ago, 2013. They're not set at 2023 levels. So that landlord might be charging significantly less. I'm talking like, in some cases, as much as half off of what the market rents are. So, I use the example of the market rent is $1,000, but this landlord over here is charging $500, right? And suddenly the landlord gets an unexpected expense, such as, oh, I've got to replace a roof after some high winds and hail. Oh, I have a large sewer problem that needs to be repaired, right? And so the landlord realizes, okay, my rents are far below market, and I just need to raise them up to closer to what the market levels are. And I'm not going to cheat my tenant or screw them over or nothing like that, but I might raise my rent from being $500 a month when the market rent is 1,000 up to $800 a month. So the tenant would still be getting a great deal, but the landlord would be able to make enough extra money to be able to pay for those extremely big expenses that sometimes come up, right? Well, any rent control law would prohibit that kind of rent increase that I just talked about right there. Okay, raising the rent $300 a month on your tenant, they'd come after you. Oh, you're trying to screw this tenant over, and you're evil landlord who's just trying to cheat. And you're sitting there like, hey, I've got these expenses, I've got these repairs that need to be made, and I just need to be able to pay for them. And they're demonizing you as though you're a piece of garbage. Well, you're not. Only thing you're trying to do is operate your business. And because you didn't raise the rents on the tenant over the years, right? Now, unfortunately, you have to add a lot of rent increases at one time on that tenant. And still, your rents are still below what the market rate is. But that's not good enough for these rent control people, okay? And you would be in violation of the law, because a $300 increase on a $500 a month rent is what, like a 60% increase? So yeah, you just simply put could not do it. You'd be limited to 5% or 10% even, and even in a high inflation year, you wouldn't be able to get more than 10% most of the time. So you'd be able to raise your rent $50 a month, which wouldn't even cover close to the amount of money that you spent on, doing those major repairs. So This is why rent control screws over the small mom and pop landlords who don't frequently raise their rents. Okay. And what it will do is it will encourage those landlords to always raise the rent. So, yeah, their tenants won't be getting these sweetheart deals anymore. And the other thing that it will do is cause landlords to either sell their properties because they just can't keep up with um, they just can't afford them anymore, or defer maintenance, defer capital expenditures, defer repairs in order to make up for the fact that they aren't getting paid enough. And this is what we see in places like New York that have had rent control in place for a long period of time. And it's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. And that doesn't even go into how much it discourages new development. Okay. The hearing once again summarized the decades long American fight over rent control. Landlords, large and small, testified that limits on their revenue would force them to cut back on maintenance or to stop renting out homes. Roberts argued that capping rent increases would encourage landlords to flip their units to short term rentals, though cities can also regulate those services. And he said that if one city enacts rent control, it could affect others nearby. This is the second time that Roberts has made a mark on housing legislation in recent weeks. He recently won an amendment to the session's major land use bill that removed mandatory upzonings for ski towns. Yeah, I don't know anything about that ski town issue, right? But what I will say is that the comments that the landlords made about rent control are 100% true. And my big gripe with a lot of the landlord policies they put in place is they don't actually talk to the landlords. Okay, we're the ones who have to come out of pocket with all of the expenses. They don't talk to the developers, the ones who actually build the properties, to say, hey, how is this going to affect you? And when they do talk to you, they think you're lying. They think you're just making stuff up because you're greedy. That's how stupid these people are. And I'm like, hey, I'll show you my books. Okay, I'll pull these books out and show you exactly why this stuff won't work. What a ridiculous joke. Okay, so I'm glad that this law did not pass in Colorado. But like I said, I don't know if this is a sign that this sort of thing is coming. It's coming. The ban on rent control in Colorado is more than 40 years old, and the state was much more pro landlord, much more pro property rights back then than they are right now. So it could be a sign that, hey, there's going to be a lot more anti landlord laws that are going to be proposed pretty soon.